Most athletes are strength training wrong and leaving tons of gains on the table. Traditional weight training methods are no longer the best way to get more explosive and powerful. Many coaches and athletes just haven't realized it yet. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the best way for any athlete to strength train to get stronger, more powerful, and more explosive, how to change your lifting throughout the year for optimal performance, and share some specific exercises that all athletes should be doing to prevent injury and improve their speed. First, I want to explain why I'm so confident about this. I've been studying lifting and strength training as well as competing in track and field for years, and after listening to some top coaches in the space, I decided to try these new training methods. I thought they might improve my performance a little bit, but they ended up transforming my athleticism completely, taking my top speed from 20 to 22 miles per hour, adding more than 5 inches to my vertical jump, and taking my 400 from 53.3 to 49.8, all in less than a year. The first thing to understand is why traditional methods of lifting aren't the best way to structure your training. There's an idea called periodization that coaches have been using for decades. And periodization basically just means changing your training throughout the year to match the demands of your sport, whether you're out of season, in your competitive season, or approaching the most important competition of the year. There are multiple different types, and the most common that I've seen is traditional periodization, where athletes go from high volume, low intensity to low volume, high intensity as the year progresses. In strength training specifically, that looks like starting with endurance lifting, where you do high reps with low weight, then transition to hypertrophy lifting, where you do moderate reps with moderate weight, before transitioning to strength training, where you do low reps with a really high weight, and finally transitioning to power, where you do relatively low reps with a relatively low weight. It's my belief that this isn't a very good strategy. Regular endurance lifting, while it can be useful in some scenarios, carries some risk because it can push you in the direction of slow twitch muscle fibers and isn't as beneficial, in my opinion, as some of the other training methods we can do in its place. On top of that, while hypertrophy can be a good goal, especially for younger athletes that are earlier on in their athletic development, generally for jumpers and sprinters, relative strength is the key. So you want to be as light as possible and as strong as possible for the most part. That means that for a lot of athletes, specifically incorporating a phase just to build muscle might not necessarily be the best way to approach things. So I think there are much better ways to structure your year of training. So now you're probably wondering, well, how would you structure a year of training? I learned most of this from Cal Dietz, who's a strength and conditioning coach at the University of Minnesota and who wrote the book Triphasic Training, which is an incredible read for any coaches or athletes who want to learn more about training. He discovered that the stretch shortening cycle is very important and that by breaking it down and training one phase of the stretch shortening cycle at a time, he can produce significant changes in athletic ability. He found this out because he had 2 throwers who could bench press the same weight, but one of them threw significantly further than the other. After running some tests, he realized that although they could produce the same power concentrically, the superior thrower was able to absorb force much more quickly eccentrically, and then could turn that force around much more quickly than the other athlete could. This suggests that the key to explosive performance isn't necessarily concentric power production all the time, but that the full stretch shortening cycle has to be considered, and we have to be good at absorbing force quickly and turning it around quickly as well. Sue's coaches, who helped him run the fastest 60-meter split of all time, Randy Huntington and Rolf Omen, talk about really similar concepts and often call them reactivity. Between all these top coaches, my biggest takeaway was that most strength training throughout most of the year should be geared toward improving our stretch shortening cycle or our reactivity. And Cal Dietz has a really specific way of doing this during the off season. First, he focuses on the eccentric portion of lifts. The eccentric is the part of a movement where force is being absorbed and muscles go into a lengthened position under load. Training it causes a ton of muscle damage and soreness, but that can lead to some really solid adaptations. And these movements give you the ability to load up really heavily because you're actually stronger eccentrically than you are concentrically. And so if you find a safe way to do it, you can load with weights higher than your 1 rep max and get a massive training stimulus. Then he focuses on the isometric portion of a movement, which is also known as the amortization phase or the turnaround. Now, isometric contractions just mean a contraction where your muscle length isn't lengthening or shortening, it is just staying the same. Getting very strong isometrically can help you reduce force leaks because the longer it takes you to turn around between your eccentric and concentric phase, the more force you lose as heat that dissipates throughout your muscles. Finally, he hits the concentric portion of movement, but he doesn't only focus on the concentric. Usually when he gets to this point, he just does full range of motion movements. The key is that he focuses on making the turnaround as fast as possible during this phase so that he's really working that stretch shortening cycle and the reactivity and developing the qualities that are necessary for athleticism. But there's actually something else I like to do before these 3 phases that I think is super important, and that is long hold isometrics. Paul Fabritz is a fan of putting an isometric phase before an eccentric phase because of its numerous benefits, such as improving mind-muscle connection, activating a lot of muscle fibers, and because they are super good for the tendons. Long hold isometrics also increase your capillary density, or the amount of small blood vessels that are spread throughout your muscles, which improves your ability to transport nutrients to recover, improves local muscular endurance, and more. And long isometrics can also help you reduce imbalances between your sides because it's really hard to compensate when you're holding a movement for extended periods of time. And finally, like I mentioned before, they are great for your tendons. And that's really important because your muscles will often adapt more quickly than your tendons will. And so you can start throwing around weights or certain levels of power that your muscles are prepared for, but your tendons are not. And that can lead to a lot of overuse injuries, which makes it very important to do things early on to prepare your tendons so that they can stay up to par with your muscles. So basically what this looks like is long isometrics for 2 to 4 weeks, eccentrics for 2 to 4 weeks, heavy isometrics for 2 to 4 weeks, and then full range of motion concentrics for 2 to 4 weeks. And that is only the off-season training. Once we get into preseason and in-season training, things start to get a lot more specific. The training so far has been preparing our tissues and our nervous system for higher intensity methods of training, and now it's time to capitalize on that preparation. There are 3 main things we have to think about during these phases of training. They are speed, range of motion, and weight. Generally speaking, we want to move faster through a shorter range of motion with lighter weights as we get closer and closer to the end of our season. You can use special kinds of tech like an eNodes sensor to track your bar speed while doing faster and faster movements, but this isn't necessary. It's just a fun little piece of gear you can pick up if you want to. What we really want to focus on is improving our turnaround time, or again, our reactivity, like I keep talking about. The advantage of going into shorter ranges of motion are that they allow you to use heavier weights, moved more quickly with faster turnaround times, when normally to achieve that you would have to use really light weights that don't stress you properly through your full range of motion. The reason for this is that, for example, during a squat, when you hit the bottom portion, that is the most difficult portion of the lift. And so if you use a weight that's light enough that you can turn it around quickly at the bottom of a squat, it probably won't be stressing you at all during the top ranges of a squat. And in fact, will probably be so light that you'll end up jumping with the weight at the end of your movement. There's nothing wrong with that, but you have to change things up if you want to be stressed through your whole range of motion. Shortening the range of motion is one way to do that. And another way is by using different loading methods such as bands and chains, which allow your exercise to be easier at the bottom and harder at the top, matching your natural strength curve and stressing you through the full range of motion. I like to mix and match through these different methodologies as the year goes on, but again, I like to trend toward going faster, shorter range of motion, and lighter weights as the year progresses. It's really important to still touch on true strength work from time to time as well. This could be something like once a week if you really want to make sure you hold on to it, and you might be able to push it to something like once every other week. It just depends on where you are in the year and what your strengths are as an athlete. Now, there are just a few more things to cover before we start talking about what specific muscles we need to hit and some great exercise examples for hitting those muscles. The first is deloading. Deloading is setting aside a period of time to reduce the intensity or volume of training to allow you to recover and realize the gains from the training you've done so far. The reason this is so important is if you keep just adding stress and intensity into your exercise, your body and nervous system often won't be able to recover and rebuild back stronger. And so taking a lighter period allows your body to adapt before you enter the next stage of training. Some people are going to need more of these than others. It depends on the individual and how intense your training is. I like to aim for at least 1 deload a month and sometimes as much as 1 deload every 3 weeks, depending on what phase of training I'm in. They work really well if you're about to switch phases. So if you're going from your long isometric phase into your heavy eccentric phase, that's a great time to take a break. Same for the heavy eccentric into isometric, and then the isometric into the concentric. My favorite way to do these is by reducing the volume massively, but by keeping intensity the same. So I usually do about 1/3 to 1/4 of the volume I was doing previously. But again, I like to keep the intensity the same because I found that if I reduce intensity too much over a week-long period, sometimes that starts to reduce people's performance. So for example, if I did 3 sets of squats with 200 pounds the previous week, during my deload, I might do 1 set of squats with 200 pounds. This makes sure my body is still receiving the same stimuli, but again at a much lower volume, which would allow me to build back and recover and not just dig myself deeper into the hole of stress. The next thing to talk about is rest. Most top coaches in the space recommend at least 4 to 5 minutes of rest if you're doing high intensity strength or power training, at least if you want that effort to be able to be replicated set after set. For beginners, you might be able to get away with something more like 3 minutes, but if you're intermediate or advanced, you really want to try to get 4 to 5 minutes on all your high quality sets. Now for accessory movements or long isometrics, it can go down to 1 or 2 minutes, but again, anything that's really intense that you want to be replicated, it should be 4 to 5 minutes rest. The next thing to talk about is contrast training. Contrast training is a mix between different types of exercises, most commonly one really heavy, slow exercise and one light, fast exercise. This type of training is insanely effective. The first time I implemented it in my own training, I noticed immediate results on the track. This is also a great way of adding a heavy stimulus without sacrificing your speed and your power. And so if you're struggling to incorporate both of those aspects, this is a great way to do it. Another thing to consider is doing cluster sets, which is where you combine 3 or more exercises that all reside at different places on the force velocity curve. So one example of this would be doing a heavy quarter squat into dumbbell jumps, into jumps assisted with a band. So that gives us one heavy slow movement, but through a partial range of motion, so it's still intense and somewhat powerful, and then one moderately powerful movement with the loaded dumbbell jumps, and then one very fast accelerated movement with the band assisted jumps. I've gotten great results with contrast training, so I highly recommend you give it a try. Now, some other methodologies I want to talk about are oscillating isometrics and AFSM training. I honestly don't know much about oscillating isometrics, so I recommend you look them up and do some research yourself, but the idea with both of these methods is that they force you to contract and relax muscles very quickly, which mimics exactly what we're doing in high intensity sports scenarios. This is really important because the biggest differences between elite athletes and regular people aren't actually the speed at which they can contract their muscles. There is a difference there, it's just not that big when compared to the speed of relaxation of muscles. Elite athletes can relax their muscles incredibly quickly compared to the average person. AFSM training, which stands for antagonistically facilitated specialized method, uses a little trick in your physiology where contracting one muscle group forces the opposite muscle group to relax, very similarly to what happens while we're on the track or on the field. So if you do something like these squat jumps where you pull up your feet very quickly and then reverse that momentum and try to jump off the ground, pulling your legs up actually helps to relax your glutes and your quads, and then you have to quickly fire them again to be able to jump off the ground. I've had a lot of success with incorporating AFSM training, so I highly recommend you look up those and oscillating isometrics. Cal Dietz has a ton of information on this if you want to learn more. Finally, we can talk about specific muscles to target and what exercises are good for hitting those muscles. As a general rule, I like to try to target every main muscle group at least once every single week. In my experience, I often start getting little overuse injuries that build up if I don't do this. It's a lot more important for your lower body than your upper body, but if you want to be as optimized as possible, I suggest you do both. Some muscles that you want to make sure you hit are the soleus and gastroc in your calves, the anterior tibialis along your shin, your quads, your hamstrings, your glutes, your hip flexors, your core, your lats, your pecs, your delts, and your hip adductors and your hip abductors. There are a million ways to hit all of these, and so I'm not going to give you examples for each one, but I will give you some of my favorite exercises that I think are very effective for improving athleticism and reducing the risk of injury. First, we have deadlifts, specifically trap bar deadlifts, which are great for your quads, your glutes, and your low back, and can be modified in countless ways for different stimuli. You can do jumps with the trap bar, you can do high pulls, you can do really heavy regular deadlifts, you can do loaded AFSM work, and the list goes on and on. The next are squats, which hit similar muscles, but have the advantage of being active during the turnaround phase, and so I think they're better for eccentrics and isometric training as well as reactivity training. And what I mean by that is when you're deadlifting, the weights hit the ground at the bottom of the movement, and so you're not active when you're in the turnaround stage, whereas with the squat, you have to be active during the turnaround stage or you're just going to collapse onto the ground. Romanian deadlift is pretty similar to these two, but it hits the glutes and hamstrings, and it is fantastic for the hamstrings. I've never seriously injured my hamstrings, and I attribute that to being really strong at Romanian deadlifts, at least relative to my other lifts. Romanian deadlifts are also very modifiable, and you can do them explosively like I did here, or slow and steady just like a regular lift. Then we have split squats, which are also very modifiable and are great for correcting imbalances, and maybe more sport specific than some of these other exercises, because sports often aren't bilateral, meaning you don't just use your legs side by side, which makes using some unilateral exercises like this very important for athletes. Some other lifts to think about are the other main compound lifts, such as bench press, overhead press, rows, and pull-ups, which are really good for your upper body. Usually with the upper body, I try to just hit one horizontal push and one horizontal pull, and one vertical push and one vertical pull every single week. And then we also have to hit our core. And with core, you usually want to do one anti-rotation movement where you're trying to stabilize yourself and keep yourself from rotating, one rotational movement where you're intentionally rotating with a load, and then some type of flexion movement where you're moving your shoulders closer to your hips or your hips closer to your shoulders. I know this is a lot of information and I probably left some important things out, so please let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I will do my best to get back to any questions you guys leave. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I was able to take my speed from 20 to 22 miles per hour, and I actually managed to do that in less than 4 months because of 5 specific things that I did. So if you want to learn exactly what those 5 things are and how you can implement them into your own training to get faster and more explosive, go ahead and watch this video.